All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I have almost 3 o'clock. Yeah, 3 o'clock. So let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. My name is Dan Han. I am the CISO for VCU, probably one of the few local boys here presenting. So I'm very, very grateful that I was able to get the opportunity to talk here. Today, what I'll be talking to you all about is a little bit of a personal experience, also experience through our organization, as how we have adapted after the pandemic, right? And especially as our organizations adapt, how does security shift? So a little bit about me. I grew up here in Richmond, Virginia. Has been CISO for VCU since 2011. So by the age of CISOs, I'll be a vampire by now, right? So I worked in IT and information security for probably about a little bit over 20 years now. Did some application development, system administration, along with database admin and a little bit of everything before I really jumped into security in the 2006, 2007 era, right? So I really love gadgets. So as a matter of fact, I got my little flipper in my pocket right now. And I love gadgets. I love coding. I'm a true technophile at heart. And I think my boss calls me the extroverted IT guy, where I look at your shoes while I'm talking instead of those on my own, right? So I got 3 little kids and a family and a cat. So that's a little bit about me, right? So now, when I was first preparing for this presentation, the retrospect of the pandemic really made me look back at my career over the past 20 years. And that really helped me to see, okay, where have we been in the past 20 years and where are we now, right? So 20 years ago, when we had these iPods, $400 devices that were revolutionary, and when cell phones were still used to make phone calls, when Wikipedia was born and asynchronous DSLs were the fastest internet service provider that's out there, life was really blissful, right? So, well, until it wasn't so much. So at that time, information security really went from being this guy to what we would like to think as this guy, or better yet, what our constituents, our users would like to think this guy, right? So now before 2010, when we really looked at information security, aside from developing policies, standards, and procedures, and doing all of the compliance stuff and so on and so forth, we focused on things like antiviruses, saying no to our users, right? Stateful inspection firewalls, saying no to our users. VPNs, saying no to our users, and things like configuration management and saying no to our users, right? So over the years, since 2010, or before 2010, rather, we built this castle and moat where we have the internal trusted area. That is our sanctuary, where all of our users and our assets live. And it is separated by all of these different technologies and security controls, where on the outside, we have the zombie-infested apocalyptic wasteland that is internet, and we have this VPN that is serving as a drawbridge, right? So in better terms, this is how the security architecture looked back then, right? So we had our internally hosted business information systems. We had our perimeter controls. We had our device controls. We have some trusted interactions between our internally hosted devices and our internally hosted ERPs and HR systems, whatever it may be. And then through the VPN, we have some of the stragglers that's outside. that is using either organization issued devices or actually mostly organizationally issued devices and some personal devices, right? So now, in early 2010s, the cloud really became a thing, right? So along with the popularization of software as a service, platforms as a service, and infrastructure as a service, the adoption of things like BYOD and things like that, we started to see a change in our organizational technology architecture. So because the cloud really being a utility-based consumption model, right, that really allows organizations to save costs, to pay for what you use. That has truly enabled the competencies and truly enabled things like organizational agility going forward. And it really was the unicorn, or so a lot of us think, that will solve all business problems. So, in the meantime, security needs to adapt. So as such, adapt, we did, right? So we implemented things like mobile device management for our BYOD devices. We implemented things like third-party risk management services, enterprise governance, risk, and compliance services, as well as things like SIMs, advanced SIMs with user entity behavior analytics that came on a little bit later, right? Along with things like layer 7 SSL TLS inspection firewalls and so on and so forth, that basically helped us to wrangle this beast that is a new enterprise architecture. So then, fast forward to about mid-2010s, DevOps became a thing. Now DevOps, kind of started stemming off in the late 2009s and probably to the 2010s, right? So this became a thing. And it took off. The CI/CD pipelines and the organizations that start to compete on the number of deploys they can do a day, and how organizations don't need to worry about patching vulnerabilities because we'll just always roll forward, right? We'll shift everything left. And because, again, organizational agility is awesome. So DevOps, microservices, serverless, right? All of these things are offering unprecedented organizational agility. And again, this is the unicorn. This is the unicorn that's going to solve all of the business problems. That is going to give the competitive advantage to all of the businesses that are out there. And for security, we need to catch up. We have to address what DevOps brought to the table. And adapt, we did again. So let's go ahead and inject sec in between dev and ops, right? And there you go. Let's go ahead and work our static application security testing, our dynamic application security testing, our dependency checks, our code repositories. Let's work all of these things into the CI/CD pipeline. Let's go ahead and generate all of the feedback and send that back over to the developers, right? So let's work these things into the developers pipeline, and there you go. So for a while, we kind of think, hey, you know what? Maybe we got this under control. So in summary, in my opinion, between 2010 and 2020, the IT environment, so our organizational structure, looks somewhat like this. So on the bottom, because of BYOD, we started seeing more of a shift in terms of the devices that are making up our organizational fleet of clients that are accessing the services that we offer. Because of the gradual adoption to cloud, we are seeing more and more systems, sometimes even core systems like our enterprise resource planning systems, and so on and so forth, getting moved out to the cloud. So as we start to see, while we are still relying a lot on the castle and moat approach, the perimeter is actually deteriorating. So, and then between 2019 and early 2020, these little guys came along, right? And then our once glorious and bustling castle emptied out. And most of our users are unfortunately left out to fend on their own in the zombie-infested apocalyptic wasteland that is the internet, right? And the IT environment from 2020 on looked something like this, where we still had our users in our trusted zones, in our high trust zones. Those users are now shifted out. And our environment is further deteriorated. So all of these different castle and moat and all of these expensive firewalls, IDS, IPS systems, all of these things, they are just sitting there. They're guarding a little bit of things, but most of us are actually sitting at home with our computers, watching Netflix on one screen and answering emails on the other, right? So then pandemic came, then what, right? So what do we see? We saw remote work. We saw equipment being taken off-site, right? So equipment like computers, sometimes office chairs, other office equipment, I have seen a little bit of everything, right? So now, coming out of the pandemic, have we asked, where are our assets? Do we know where each one of our assets are at the moment? Maybe some of us do, maybe some of us don't, right? The computers, yeah, sure, great. What about the office chairs and those type of things, right? Maybe, maybe not. So can we manage our assets remotely? So some of the organizations may be ready to do this when the pandemic hit, where devices can be managed regardless of where they are. But some other organizations may not be able to do that, where management of devices off-site requires a VPN connection. And that VPN connection had to be initiated by the individual user, right? So when we move these devices out of our trusted zones, they are going into a hostile environment. Do we know what these devices are next to? Do we know who is using these devices? Is it our employees? Is it their kids? Is it their spouse? Is it anybody else, right? We don't know that. And to compound onto everything else, anybody ever heard of this overemployed subreddit? Okay, so I see some hands up. Nice. So, but yeah, I mean, people will go out there and they'll get multiple jobs, right? So, are people even working, or do they just have like 14 laptops in front of them with a mouse jiggler everywhere, right? I mean, so I don't know. So I mean, these are all challenges that the pandemic has brought forth. But as an organization, obviously, we needed to do something. So there you go. We got it. Let's go ahead and remote work all the things, and let's go forward with this, right? So I think, for the most part, a lot of the organizations have handled the emergency the pandemic brought forth very well. So folks were able to transition people out. They were able to set up by increasing VPN licenses, or just setting up typical laptops that they can hand out to people. I mean, folks were able to respond fairly well to keep the business running. However, corners were cut. I don't know about all of you, but I think at least in my organization, there were some corners that were cut. But because, again, we were in an emergency situation, and now we have to pay that technical debt that we have built over the years. So one of the primary examples, everybody heard of the LastPass breach and how that happened? Or actually, I think LastPass had like 3 different issues late last year. So basically, long story short, the LastPass employee that's involved in this particular breach really had access to some highly sensitive environments that contain the backups of everyone's, let's just put it this way, of everybody's vaults, okay? So password vaults. Now, this particular engineer worked from home, and this particular engineer also had a Plex server that has not been patched since 2020. The adversaries in this case, and I believe the adversaries sounds like they're is probably more so of a targeted attack. But the adversaries in this particular case ended up compromising the Plex server and used the Plex server to pivot into the user's machine, which then ended up stealing the keys necessary for the repository that actually contained all of the password vaults. Now, once the password vaults were hijacked, I don't know if you guys are following this story or not, but I mean that's LastPass's bread and butter. They try to safeguard other people's passwords, right? The bottom line is when you can't do that, that is going to cause some significant impact to your business. Now, I don't know where LastPass is now, but from some of the folks that I have spoken with who have used LastPass in their organizations, they are transitioning away from LastPass and going to an alternative solution, like 1Password or something like that, right? So again, this particular breach is actually related to someone working remotely. We started seeing things like this in news articles. Stop using your work laptop or phone for personal stuff, because I know you are, right? We have had security incidents in our university where our sensors picked up certain things, and it turns out it was someone's kid is using her laptop to play some online game, and the game, of course, had a crypto miner or something like that in there. So either way, when these devices are leaving your organization, you really don't know what's really happening, right? So, quick show of hands, who think remote or hybrid work is going to go away? What is the question? The question is, who thinks remote and hybrid work will go away? Nobody? I agree with you. So I think a lot of us, I mean, we are being asked to return to office, right? I mean, but none of us are, at least I don't believe none of us are being asked to return to office on a full-time basis, right? I mean, usually it's like, okay, you go in two days a week, 3 days a week, whatever it is, right? You pick the dates, or hey, here are the two days of the week that everybody's going to be in the office. And I think that's good, right? But the bottom line is what the pandemic has showed us is that organizations can't operate effectively. They can't operate effectively remotely. And for some of these individual units that have never pioneered remote work, I think generally speaking, IT security, like all of our organizations, or our functional units, we have done this in the past, right? But other areas, finance, HR, for instance, they may not have done these type of things, but the pandemic showed them that they can. They can do these things. And when people know that, hey, you know what, I can do these type of things, there are going to be preferences that people will have, right? So a lot of times, from an organizational perspective, the ability to offer hybrid work can also be seen as a competitive advantage to draw in new staff. So because of the pandemic, the organization has to, again, change and adapt. So in my opinion, these are the things that the organization needs to think about, right? So one is people need to be able to work from anywhere. They would like to work from at any time, and ideally, folks would like to work from any device, right? So as a matter of fact, this is nothing new. So in 2016, PricewaterhouseCoopers actually conducted a study where they surveyed some Gen Z workers. And these are the things that showed up in the Gen Z survey. These are what matters to the next generation workforce. So the pandemic simply accelerated it. That's all it is, right? So now, as security professionals, when the business aspirations for future organizations are these, how do we deal with these type of things? So first and foremost, let's go back to the basics, right? So do we know what we want to protect? So I think one of the good questions to ask is always, okay, well, what is the problem we're trying to solve, right? So do we protect everything? Do we protect some things? How much is it going to cost us to protect everything? How much is it going to cost us to protect some things, right? I mean, so in that sense, my philosophy has always been that I would never want to spend $1,000 to put an alarm on a $500 car, right? That is not something that we want to do. So in that sense, we need to really look at risks, and we need to understand, number one, the business, and what really matters to the business. And based on that, we need to understand, okay, what are some of these core crown jewels, the assets, and then map out the transactions, for these systems, right? Aside from understanding these things, we have to understand our adversaries. So what are the threats that are targeting all of these different crown jewels that are out there? What are the TTPs of the threat actors? So the tactics, tools, and procedures, right? And have we done things like asset classification, data classification? Do we treat everything the same? Because in my opinion, we really shouldn't. Because if we do treat everything the same, then we are effectively wasting some resources, right? So are we threat modeling based on the information that we know against our critical assets? So over here, you got Bruce Wayne and Batman's threat model, but are we doing that for our organizations? So that feeds into another concept which was introduced back in early 2010s at a DevOps conference, and the phrase is identity is the new perimeter. I think at that time this rang true to a certain extent, but I would argue that this is no longer the case. So I would say that identity contributes to the new perimeter. So it is providing signals. So the new perimeter really is based on signals, right? So, and those signals are things like identity, right? So who someone is, how reasonable can we validate that someone or something's identity. It's also based on device. It's based on things like location. Where are you? It's based on things like the workload. What type of applications are accessing other things? I mean, so what are the interactions, right? It is based on things like behavioral signals. When is something happening? How long is it happening for? What is the frequency? And so on and so forth. And I think some of the modern technologies, Microsoft actually introduced something in their preview build for Windows 11 recently that actually allows Windows to track proximity of devices. So think about things like familiar devices, like your cell phone. So if I was able to tell that, hey, when I'm logging on from this laptop, my cell phone is right next to it, that can essentially be another validation point that we can use to ensure that the session, the interaction, is trustworthy, right? So going farther beyond the perimeter, we need to look at authentication, right? So a lot of times we talk about risk-based authentication. I think back in the early 2010s, a lot of this is really talking about multi-factor authentication, something you know, something you are, something you have, right? So that could be an RSA card, it could be a app that does push or something like that. But the bottom line is, when we look at all of our business assets in different lenses, when we have our top tier assets, medium tier, lower tier, and so on and so forth, the authentication requirements should always also be somewhat different as well. So when I look at authentication, a lot of times, I think authentication as a functionality between the sensitivity of the assets to the confidence of the signals that we receive. So the confidence of the signals is the signal, a very simple signal can be a correct password. That could be a signal, right? So that is the most basic form of authentication. Now, is that an adequate signal for someone to log into the ERP remotely? Probably not, right? Now, is that an adequate signal for someone to log in and access some publicly available flyer? Yeah, maybe. I mean, why would you put that behind a password protected site? I don't know, but if you do, is that enough? Yeah, possibly, right? I mean, that's okay. So I think again, a lot of this boils back down to how much, or what kind of sensitivity do we attribute to each one of our assets, right? So going beyond authentication, we want to look at authorization. So the concept that I have thought about is really this idea of continuous authorization, right? Where we take some of these different data points based on identity, device, location, behavior, and proximity, and continuously evaluate the interactions between a subject and an object. And when any of these signals change, then essentially we can use those changes in the signal to alter how the interaction would work. So in other words, as an example, if I have my laptop here, right, it was sitting in my office and I am interacting with some internal system, now I close the lid, I take it over here. The location changes, but the device is still the same. The signals that are being sent into the authorization system should also take that signal into consideration when it actually provides me with access, right? So basically the idea is we want to be able to make dynamic and automated decisions based on changes in these signals. So I don't like buzzwords as much as all of you here. Please do not break my kneecaps for saying zero trust. But some of these things that I just alluded to are concepts from zero trust. Now, zero trust is a fantastic concept. I think if implemented well, it works great, right? But the components that really makes up a true zero trust model, I mean, it's very complex. So, and I think there are some vendors that are coming pretty close in terms of providing different systems that can accomplish all of the zero trust needs, but really to architect everything under zero trust is difficult. However, that does not mean that we cannot take bits and pieces from this concept and apply it into our organizational architecture, right? So in my mind, things that matter in zero trust is one, the continuous examination of interactions between a subject or a client, right, and an object or a service, okay? So second, we want to be able to make those dynamic decisions in terms of provisioning of access and deprovisioning of access and so on and so forth. We want to be able to, based off of these signals, we want to be able to make those changes on the fly, if we can, right? And then we want to implement controls around the workloads to really minimize the blast radius. So any type of individually compromised assets, any type of individually compromised interaction or session is going to have a minimal amount of impact against other sessions, against other systems, right? So now, in that sense, I think a post-pandemic security model really should be a risk-based and a location-agnostic approach, right? Where we actually rely on a collection of signals that provides the authenticity of the session. So there are several aspirational goals that at least I think that we should all take into consideration when building this model. And the first is, we want to provide consistent protection regardless of where you are. Because right now, with our castle and moat approach, when you are inside of your high trust zone, you have all of your Palo Altos and your, I don't know, FireEyes, whatever they are, right? I mean, that's sitting in there doing all of your network-based and or sometimes even host-based detection and prevention, right? Now, when you are outside of that zone, you may not have all of those protection. You may not have all of the telemetry. In the case of these devices sitting out in somebody's house, with a vulnerable Plex server on the network, we wouldn't even know about it, right? So we want to make sure that regardless of where our assets are, they should receive the same level of protection. And by that extension, we should have the same level of visibility as security professionals. So second, we want to provide the same experience. So the end user experience is very important. And I stress on this because all of the organizational metamorphosis that happened over the years, the DevOps, the cloud adoption, and stuff like that, if you really peel back the layers, why did those things happen? To bypass IT. Why are they bypassing IT, right? Because we say no all the time. So I think we, at least in my opinion, we did this to ourselves somewhat. So we need to make sure that we are providing a consistent experience to the users. So regardless of where they are, again, if they are sitting at home versus they're in the office, the experience should be the same. Open up the laptop. You should be able to access whatever you need to access. Whatever protections that you have should always be there, right? So I think I'm a firm believer that the best security is security that is invisible. It's invisible to the users, but it's effective, okay? So whatever we can do to minimize the visibility of security is going to be good. And it will actually enhance adoption by the end user population, right? We want to minimize the blast radius, and then we want to be able to provide and also ingest high fidelity signals. So conceptually, when we take a look at some of these aspirations, we can actually take a page out of the software-defined anything playbook, right? So rather than looking at trusted versus untrusted zones, I think now we need to look at layers. So at the very top, you're going to have the service layers, which would contain our systems, right? I mean, these are our ERPs, our HR systems, our CRMs, our LMS, whatever they are in there, right? Regardless of where they are, these are the services that we are providing to our constituents. At the bottom, you have your client layer. Again, clients, we don't care where they are, right? So you can be on-prem, you can be out on the internet. It doesn't matter. And the focus that we should have is not necessarily so much on these traditional perimeter controls, that is a VPN, but rather in between the client and service layer, we need to have a security layer that is abstracted out from everything else. So a better diagram that would show something like this would probably be something here, right? I mean, where you actually see, regardless of where you are, what device you are using, again, this is the aspiration, you should be able to receive the same security policies, and you should be able to access the same thing, regardless of where your services are. So to accomplish some of these things, in my opinion, again, we need to look at things like classification of assets. We need to build our security control models. So I'm not going to get too much ahead of myself, but basically, when we look at the security control models, we have to define some of the. We have to really define. Okay, where do we want our access controls to be, right? I mean, so I think sometimes when we look at our security control layers, we always focus on one particular layer, and I'm going to go into that just a little bit. And when we look at that one single layer and we focus so much on it, we end up making that layer so complex that it's not supportable going forward. So that is something that we need to really be aware of. We want to look at things like dynamic role-based access provisioning, right? So with the granularity of the layers of controls, one of the things that we need to remember is network is not the only layer. Endpoint is not the only layer. There are tons and tons of other layers that we can look at. There are application layer controls. There are workload layer controls. We can control storage, and we can control data at the end of the day, right? I mean, so it is not about building the perfect control for every single layer, but rather with a combination of the controls that we implement in all of these layers, the controls should be manageable, for one, should be sustainable, and then for two, the controls, when combined together, would give you a good zero trust approach going forward, right? So, and that brings us to the limiting the blast radius. And like I mentioned before, there are different ways for you to do that. Has anybody ever gone down the micro-segmentation route and saying, hey, you know what, I'm going to do micro-segmentation perfect, and then you end up with like 500 network segments? Anybody? Don't be shy. All right, anyway. So yeah, so again, just from experience, right? I mean, you got to fail sometimes. So when you look at controls, there are different ways. So I think a lot of times, when people talk about, okay, zero trust or whatever, they tend to negate things like your defense in depth, which is the old way of thinking security. But I think defense in depth is still very much at play, because the bottom line is you cannot put all your eggs in one basket. You try to go and run your micro segmentation with 500 network segments. Yeah, good luck supporting that. That one network engineer leaves. It's like, yep, let's go ahead and do a network redesign. So anyway, but yeah, I mean, the bottom line is when we are designing these controls, let's design what's reasonable, right? So it needs to be reasonable. And further, we have to design it to spec, and we have to minimize the exceptions. So in my own personal experience, working in the university environment, so for those of you who are not familiar with university environments, you probably think about universities as, a place where people learn stuff. Maybe some people do some research. Maybe there's a hospital or something like that, right? So universities, they're typically operated like a small city. So what I mean by that is, aside from all of these things like education, research, healthcare that we do, we have retail, right? So we sell stuff. We have dining services. We have hospitality, right? We have financial services. So parts of us are regulated like a bank. And then on top of that, depending on the research du jour our researchers decide to do, I mean, it could be regulated under NERC or something from the federal government. So the university is an interesting beast. Now, why I mentioned that is when we try to design controls, a lot of times we have requests for exceptions, because we're going to have this one single group is like, hey, you know what? I don't like that network that you're designing, because I don't want anybody else to touch my stuff for my 5 people in this department on this network, right? I mean, I need you to design a whole new network for us. Or I want a new VPN group that only allows these people to access this. Now, on the surface, yes, that's a good thing, right? I mean, because again, we're building granular controls, but a lot of times when we're building those type of things, when they veer away from the norm, it becomes a support nightmare. Building 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 50 of those might be supportable. 300, not so much, right? So whenever you're designing controls around all of these different segments, try not to implement a whole lot of exceptions. So if someone were to say, hey, I want a VPN group that will do this, well, can we just create a group to allow you to do something with your application? So although somebody can knock on your door when they connect to a VPN, they still can't log into your system, right? So when we operationalize all of these things, what do we really need to do, right? So the first and foremost, we have to understand the business mission and the supporting assets. So a lot of times, we wear our own set of blinders when we are operating in security. And sometimes we don't necessarily talk to the business leaders, but the bottom line is, they know the best about what the business mission is and what the most critical assets are. And that is what we need to understand first and foremost, right? So asset classification, data classification, that is essential. Because again, without doing any type of classification, if you're applying the same exact controls for everything to everything, right? You are probably going to end up wasting some resources. So we want to perform some threat modeling for our top tier assets. So for those assets that we deem as the most important, we absolutely want to know, okay, what are the threats these assets would face, right? So, and we want to understand the threat actors. So in the university environment, some top secret nation state threat actor is probably not going to come after our PCI data, right? They're probably going to go after those nuclear missile research that's happening over somewhere, right? I mean, so whereas our ransomware threat actors are probably going to go after your Active Directories, your ADCS, and all of these different things. So again, understanding all of these different threat actors and what their TTPs are is going to be very important. And threat modeling all of this is also going to be absolutely essential. So once you do all of that, you have to catalog what is available to you, right? So the bottom line is none of us have infinite budget. So I actually teach another class over at VCU, and one of my students who works for a nonprofit, she told me, well, I'm really interested in hearing about Fortune 500's perspective, when they have unlimited budget to implement security. I was like, okay, yeah, I don't think that's the case, So, but either way, I mean, the bottom line is all of us need to worry about budget, right? I mean, so we need to catalog the controls that we have, maybe identify the gaps that we have, and trying to figure out, okay, how can we go and get the necessary fundings to get those controls? But from the control perspective, look at things like authentication, right? Your traditional username and passwords, things like multi-factor authentication. What do you have? Passwordless authentication. If you're using that, great, awesome. Authorizations. If you're not managing your IAM group, don't work with them. Understand their workflows. So how can we use those automation to basically populate some of these access groups, especially to those critical assets that are out there, right? Your device-based controls, things like all of your AVs, EDRs, XDRs, MDRs, and so on and so forth, right? Any type of certificates that you can issue out to the device, domain memberships, any type of device health indicators. These are all things that we can potentially leverage. Understand all of these things. And I put something in bold over here, host-based firewalls. Guess what? When people are at home, this is going to save your bacon. I mean, even when they're not at home, you probably should have this anyway, right? So, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, lastly, look at things like behavior type of data. Do you have any type of UEBA platforms? So user entity and behavior analytics platforms. Any type of SIM data, are you tuning those things? Are you getting the correct metrics out of them? Do you have a SOAR platform? Security orchestration, automation, and response. So if you have those type of platforms, do you have the correct playbooks that are put out there? And once you have these catalog controls documented and your assets classified, then you can really start looking at selecting controls for different tiers of assets, right? Under different scenarios. So in my example here, I had access from personal device, anything about requiring device posture checks, access from known locations, unknown locations, any type of provisioning, and then monitoring and response, and so on and so forth. So again, in my example here, we are not treating each one of the access requirements to each one of the assets the same, or each tier of the assets the same, right? So for your tier 3 assets, over here is probably the least sensitive. In that sense, okay, access from known location, maybe we're not going to require MFA, right? And then device posture, okay, we're not going to require device posture. Can you access from a personal device? Yeah, sure, you can access from a personal device. versus your tier 1 asset, maybe you can't do that, right? So understanding how you want to build this model out and understanding what are all of the different scenarios that you would have, building something like this is going to be helpful. Now, from a technology perspective, there are a whole lot of technology service providers that would actually help you to accomplish some of these things. So even before the pandemic came along, there are these vendors that sell, back at that time it's called SASE, and now it's called SSE, so it stands for Secure Service Edge. So these vendors, what they do is they sell these type of cloud-based services that would actually have firewalls as a service. They will have secure web gateways. It would have sandboxes, your traditional IDS, IPS, your DLP platforms, and also some type of internal access, whether that's through a always-on persistent VPN or a reverse proxy. So they would sell these type of services out there, right? Now, organizations, I think, arguably were slower in adopting these type of technologies until the pandemic hit, and then everybody, basically jumped on this bandwagon, because this particular set of technologies do allow you to provide some of those consistent experience that your users are going to have, right? So I'm not going to rattle off all of these names, but all of these guys, they do it. So now, is this approach through using SSEs the only way? No, absolutely not. There are other ways for you to do this, right? I mean, so like always-on full tunnel VPN, for instance, would help you do this. Now, in the VCU case, we can't do that because we allow our students to use VPN. We're not full tunneling VPN for our students, okay? We just don't have the bandwidth for it, right? So, so in that sense, for organizations where you're only dealing with employees and stuff like that, and you're only allowing full tunnel VPNs from your trusted devices and so on and so forth, or your issue devices, this is definitely an acceptable way of approaching this, where you look at things like you're routing all of the traffic back to on-prem, and then you send all of your traffic through your existing on-prem security stack back out to the internet. All while at the same time, you still give the same user experience to our end users going forward, right? So other things that people can consider are things like VDIs and application virtualization. So for certain applications that people need to access remotely, you can completely use things like application virtualization like Citrix, VMware Workspace, and so on and so forth to be able to help facilitate that type of access, right? Now, one thing that I highlight down here is the real-time access provisioning. So this is extremely important because, again, we want to be able to make decisions, access decisions, based on near real-time data, right? So how many people are still using SAML-based authentication? Okay, so we still have quite a few of those. So here's the problem with SAML, right? So when you do SAML-based authentication, the SAML attributes that shows up in the SAML assertion, that stays with that session until the user is re-authenticated. So basically what happens is if the user needs to re-authenticate in order for something to change, and say the user group changed, you're not going to get that. The person all of a sudden went from being a ERP admin down to a desktop support technician or something like that. They're going to retain that ERP access until that SAML ticket until that SAML ticket expires. So some other mechanisms that can be used to do this are things like system for cross-domain identity management, so SCIM provisioning. So that is something that can be considered to really give you some additional faster turnaround, right? So from the device perspective, I'm not going to go through all of this because I got a 2-minute warning. So you want to make sure that you're configuring your devices and those devices are prepped for remote work or work from anywhere. Most importantly, you make sure these devices can be supported remotely, right? And you make sure that you get that host-based firewall turned on, bidirectional. If you can't block, if you can't do default deny, and egress is going to be hard to do default deny. If you can't do default deny, at least do things like SMB, right? RDP on the egress side of things, because you probably, everybody's aware of that. That's an Outlook bug candidate for vulnerability of the year for 2023. Yeah, so if you only allow SMB traffic to somewhere you trust, hey, you know what? That is gonna, okay. I got STF, yes! All right. So, all right. With that said, I think I am going to go ahead and call it quits. I have one more slide, but basically, I think this one is talking about simplicity. But think about how you can simplify the access structure. So if you're starting to trust this device, maybe you take MFA away. One experience I have, I'm just going to take 30 seconds. One experience I have is when I told my folks that, hey, you know what? By implementing this new technology, you don't have to go and do your multi-factor authentication and log into VPN anymore. They were like, wait, I don't have to do that, but you are monitoring my internet traffic? Yeah, go for it. I'm happy. I'm good. I love it. So think about how you can simplify things and sell it from that perspective. So with that said, thank you very much. If you have any questions, come up and talk to me. Thanks.